I'd like to welcome our audience to episode 7 of the Wide Open podcast. My name is Bruce Huberman, and my co-host is Paul Asiante. Our executive producer and sound engineer is James Spavelko, and our social media producer is Marile Fuentes. So it really gives me so much pleasure to introduce our next guest, Ted Seides. Ted is the founder of the popular Capital Allocator podcast. It's the number one institutional podcast out there. So we'll give you all that information at the end so you can follow Ted. And we're just so, fortunate. Ted is a friend of my co-host. Paul, it's all you, my friend.
So, Ted, I've been super looking forward to this because you've sort of piqued my interest in podcasting. And I know that wasn't your original jumping into your professional career, but you've created this vehicle and you use Capital Allocators as its driver into podcasts. And so many people follow it. And I just wanted to know what it is that sort of got your thinking to, all right, I've done my financial stuff. I'm not done. I've got other things to do. Let's do this. Because I feel like you were sort of one of the first guys in this space.
Coach, you make it sound like it was a plan.
Yeah.
Well, I spent 20-something years in the investing business and was in a partnership for 14 years that was both successful and, like many partnerships, challenging in some ways. And I decided to leave in 2014. I left in 2015 without knowing what was coming next. And to be clear, even though it was in the investment business, even though it was successful, I was 31 when I started it. I didn't own a whole lot of it. And I did not have the kind of money someone might expect to just be, hey, I'm done, I'm checked out for the rest of my life. So I was also thinking about what's my next job going to be. And I went through a couple of years where I did some consulting projects, and it was an interesting time. People would reach out and say, hey, are you interested in this type of thing? And nothing felt right. And a good friend of mine said, don't say no, just say, yes, you'll do it as a consulting project and date before you get married. Which is actually a good lesson in many walks of life.
Right.
So I did that. And one of the things that happened was I had written a book about hedge funds. And I was on a couple podcasts. And this goes back 2015, 2016, say. And one day I woke up and said, that might be a fun thing for me to run around and talk to my old friends. Because I was going crazy. I had too much time on my hands. And it started that way. It never would have thought that it could be a business. I used to joke with people that here's the business model, which is, by the way, is not something I learned at business school. Coach, you and I are going to have a conversation. We're going to share it with whoever wants to listen for free. And that's the business model. We'll have so many people listening that will make it up in volume, but none of them will ever pay. So there was nothing about it that would have told you that it should have been a business. And I just found that I really enjoyed doing it. And after a couple of years, and I was doing other things on the side and trying to figure out what my actual job was going to be, it sort of turned into its own business, which has become the core of a whole bunch of activities I'm doing today.
It's amazing. It's amazing. And just so you all know out there, Ted came up and we did a podcast at Trinity, which I was blown away that he would even waste his time to come visit me. I thought I'd be visiting him. And then I got to go to one of his Capital Allocator conferences, if you will, down in Florida. And I walk into this room and there's hundreds of people and they're all working for Ted or working with Ted, or they know somebody who knows somebody. And I think Ted is probably the king of symbiosis. He is constantly putting people together and making 1 and 1 equal 4. And Ted is this your purpose? Is this really what you want to be doing?
Well, I'm 53, and it took me at least 50 years to realize how much I love doing just that. And I never thought of it as symbiosis. But Coach, you know this because you're exactly the same way. There is something I love about bringing people together where it makes sense for them to be together and letting them take the ball and run with it. And so, yes, in a sense, right? So I do that, but it's almost entirely in my own niche in this professional world that I lived in for 20, 25 years. And it may sound surprising to you, but it was only about 2 years ago that I internalized for the first time that I actually have a good network and I know a lot of people.
Oh my Lord. You were just in denial that all that time?
No, there was just something about the podcast and, people I've met over the last quarter century that because of the platform of the podcast would come out of the woodwork and say, oh, I listened to your episode with Coach Paul. It's so great. I've been following what you're doing. And, people I met 20 years ago. And after that duration, right, it's different if you're a first-year coach and if you've had your 12, 13, 14 national championships and all these kids on your team who are no longer kids and are out in the world doing great things that you've had in a place in their life. I may have had a small place in their life back then, but now I have this cool platform and opportunity to help people kind of tell their own story. And it took a while, but yeah, now I kind of understand, hey, this is my team jokes. I'm 1 degree of separation from anyone in the investment world, which is a pretty, not the world, but the investment world, which is a pretty big world. And it's pretty fun to be able to connect people in that way.
So I'm curious, Ted, and this is the first time we're meeting, but a little bit about your early background, where you grew up and how this sort of evolved. Were your parents in that field? So how did it get going with you? And did you have siblings that are also doing similar things, or?
Yeah, well, let me frame it by saying in the right context. So I want to say this in the right way. I always felt like I was a little bit of an outsider. And I say the right way because if you look at the world, like being born in the US, you're an insider. Being born a white male, you're an insider. So I don't want to say in the broad global perspective, but it was my feelings, not necessarily, what was true. And so I grew up in Westchester County, New York. I went to a fantastic small public school called Edgemont High School. And just to start with this, Edgemont is in Scarsdale, well-known rough and tumble streets of Scarsdale, New York, right? I grew up on, I would laugh, the other side of the track. So there were 2 or 3 streets in Hartsdale, New York, that were part of Edgemont School. And so I wasn't even in Scarsdale. And that was just, so my father is a psychiatrist. He's still alive, 92. He doesn't practice anymore. My mother was a preschool teacher. They knew nothing about, let's just forget about the business world, but in some ways, the way the world works. And so, my upbringing, I would say from the positive side, I was able to take for granted what unconditional love meant. I mean, there was security. My parents had been together for 55 years. There were things that weren't a question at the time. But there are also things like anyone. And so, I have 3 kids and 2 stepkids now, and I don't know exactly how I'll wound them. I've just learned that I will in some way, shape, or form. And one of the things I learned as an adult is there are some things I really wish I felt like I should have been taught by my parents. And what you learn is that, well, they weren't taught, so they can't teach you. So that was my upbringing. I have an older brother and a younger sister. Neither of them are anywhere near finance. I did have a actual rich uncle. People talk about your rich uncle, but I had an actual rich uncle who wasn't in finance, but lived on the West Coast. And so I wasn't particularly close with him. And I think that subtly my parents were insecure about money. And that was something that I now hear in questions they ask me, like, are you okay? Or, not really understanding. And so I had this thing in the back of my head. I think I would have been a doctor if I was sort of just told, go do what you love. I would have been a doctor. I think I would have loved that. But my father had always said, don't be a doctor. There are better ways of making a living. So it was always about money in some way. And I think that was the path I took a little bit academically. And then I just came into this career out of college. I was applying for jobs. And, this was the first job I got, happened to be in this field.
Why Yale?
Uh,
How did your process get you to Yale?
It was the wrong process. Good outcome, wrong process. My father went to Yale. I did not fall in love with a school when I applied, probably because I didn't visit Trinity, but that's a separate thing.
Not too late.
But I didn't. It feels a little late at this point. So I applied to a bunch of schools. Yale was the best school I got into. And my father had said, look, if you get into a Yale, Harvard, or Princeton, you just go. Don't ask questions. I actually hated it when I visited. I didn't really particularly like it my freshman year either. But it's Yale. So you stick it out. And
yeah.
And that was the path. So it wasn't I have twins now that are seniors. As you know, my daughter's going to Clemson next year. It was her out and out first choice. And, through good grace, through hard work on her part, she got in. And that's, I'm so excited for her because it's where she wanted to go to school.
Right.
It had nothing to do that for me. It was the best school I got into, so I went.
Yeah, exactly.
And you followed that up, eventually going to a grad school. I mean, years out, being out in the workforce for a bit, and then hitting the old Cambridge.
Yeah, so that was a different story. I worked at the Yale Investments office under a legendary guy named David Swenson who passed away a couple of years ago. And I loved what I did. It was the only job I had at that point. But I had in the back of my head, I wanted to go not to business school. I wanted to go to Harvard Business School. And the reason really wasn't so much the brand, but I had a chance to get exposed to the case study style of teaching. And I loved it. I was just done with textbook teaching and being lectured at. So I wasn't interested in that. And then everyone I met when I worked at Yale, if they had been to Harvard Business School, they said, if you get in, go. Don't worry about why. You'll figure that out later. Any other business school, Stanford, Wharton, it didn't matter what it was. There was sort of a intellectual thought, well, what's business school really about? What are you trying to get out of it? There was always a rationale. But 100% of the people I had met that went to Harvard said, if you get in, go. You'll figure it out why later. And so I got in and I went and I figured out why later. And that was an extraordinary experience.
Did you tell me, Ted, that whilst at Harvard Business School, you met or bumped into Scott Snook? Did you tell me that?
No, he came later, but okay. I saw him speak at one of our reunions and I was blown away. Away.
So Scott Snook, I coached at West Point. His wife graduated first in the class at West Point. Amazing couple. And now he's teaching leadership there. And ironically, today, he was the keynote speaker at Danny Meyer's company retreat. And so
that's fantastic.
Danny sends me a picture, and it's a picture of Scott's presentation, and on it is a picture of me. And I said, why would you devalue your presentation by having a picture of me? It makes no sense at all. He's amazing. And along those lines, and this comes back to something I'm going to ask you later, I got a call yesterday from one of his classmates, retired General James McConville, who was the highest ranking soldier in the Army. And they were teammates at West Point. Amazing guys.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, some of the relationships that you develop early on, and you don't realize how their influence stays with you. And then, you come back and you look at it and it's really, it comes full circle. So you started this podcast and now you're like a legendary podcaster. And so how has it changed? In 2017, I think you started, and how has it evolved for you? Are you obviously you're putting a lot, probably more time in today than you did back then, but what have you learned? What are some of the pitfalls, and what's on the horizon?
Thanks, Bruce. Well, learnings you could group into a couple different buckets, right? So one is the content itself. Like, what do you learn about doing podcasts? There's lessons about this as what's become a business around it. And then there's lessons about what I've learned from the guests. So 3 different categories. And I guess if you have a preference, I can dive into any one of those 3.
I'm sure you can. But I'm just, Paul and I never had any background as well, in podcasting. I had a squash podcast that I started a few years ago, and it was just dedicated to squash. That's how, I've known Paul forever because my son's been a player since he's very young, and had him on the podcast, which was an amazing thing. And then he asked to do my final, podcast with him, and we did, and we just enjoyed it. And I don't know if you find this, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I find it so, like, when we're done with this, I am so exhilarated because it's so, like, exciting. And you have, like, all this energy that just stays with you for hours after the recordings and stuff. I just find it, and it just makes me feel good. And I'm an oral surgeon, and I work full time, and I'm busy. But this is like a great outlet for me, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah. So, Ted, what have you learned from some of your guests?
Yeah.
Because the essence of this podcast is my belief that all highly successful people in every walk of life have similar qualities, attributes, work ethic, the imposter syndrome, whatever it is that motivates them. So what have you learned from some of your guests?
Yeah. So I won't go into the technical side because it is its own niche, right? Almost all, with some outstanding leaders like you, Coach, notwithstanding, but there's a reason for it. Almost all the conversations are with either money managers or the money managers' clients. And that's kind of the world I lived in. So a lot of it is about investing. And what I would say from at least that part of it that's kind of interesting, it goes back to what I mentioned about feeling like an outsider. I was in the world of investing money in other money managers. So I wasn't picking stocks. I wasn't doing deals. I was picking money managers. And when you do that for a while, you do feel like a little bit of an outsider. You kind of feel like, I'm not quite in the game. The funny part about when I started the podcast, I was like, well, now since I'm not even in that game, I'm even more on the outside. And so when you're in the role of giving money to money managers, you're pretty wide and not that deep. So you might be investing in Asia and the US and Europe and in stocks and in bonds and in private equity. You're picking people to do all of those different things, but you're not an expert in any one. One of the things that's happened from the podcast is I've sort of become one of the few people that is wide across those people. So the chief investment officer at Yale or Princeton or Trinity or a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund, how do they do what they do and what's similar and different? But there aren't very many people who have the opportunity to talk to all of those people. So it's even wider in some sense. And then you kind of bring that all together. That's some of the technical stuff. On the more interesting stuff, I would say, I put a book together during COVID that were the lessons that I had taken away from the first, say, 150 episodes. And almost all of those lessons weren't investment lessons. It was things like, how do you make great decisions? There was a chapter on leadership. What are the basic principles of leadership? Not that I am a great leader, but if I talk to you, Coach, and I talk to someone who's leading a great organization, and I talk to a friend of mine who was in the Marines, like, what are the elements of leadership that are the same? What are the elements of managing people that are the same? And then, of course, I talked about interviewing because so much of what I had done in my career was interviewing, but I didn't know what I was doing. And I started the podcast, I didn't know what I was doing. But after enough reps, you start to sort of figure some things out about how do you get information from people when you're interviewing them. So those are at the category level, those are some of the things. And then I think, one of the questions I always ask people at the end, I ask people about their favorite life lessons or things they learned. And you do see common patterns about the importance of relationships, about the importance of slowing down, even these high-powered people, about listening, all these different things that are common that you hear. But as you get a little older, you sort of actually do it and you see the value of it.
Well, it's interesting. I think your father was wrong. And the reason I think he was wrong is you would have been an amazing doctor because of all the people I've spoken to, you have the best bedside manner. You make people comfortable and the conversation flows. And if there's a pregnant pause, it's not awkward. It's because it's reflective. And I have found that's what makes you different. And obviously, it's who you are, so you don't even realize you're doing it. But it's pretty cool.
Yeah, Coach, I appreciate that. I am sure that you're right. I was a kid who wanted to do the right thing. And if my parents told me the right thing was X, I would go do X.
Sure.
And, that ultimately led me where I got, with lots of bumps along the way. But there were times, every time I had a little stumble, I'd say, gosh, I should have been a doctor. I'd have enjoyed that so much.
Yeah. By the way, everybody, one of Ted's shared interests with me is tennis. And so, Ted, how's that forehand coming along?
Coach, it's a work in progress. It's funny. So tennis is my favorite sport. Tennis, skiing in the winter, but really tennis. And I just never had that great training as a kid. I played on my high school team, but wasn't like a USTA player. And so you watched me hit a couple forehands. And there are things you told me I'd never heard before that you would think as a decent player, not a great player, but a decent player, you would think it's coming along. There's a long way to go. It's no Carlos Alcaraz forehand.
That's a hell of a forehand. That's a shotgun.
It's funny. I just was listening to Gael Monfils, and I guess he played Carlos last night.
Yeah.
And there were some clips of him talking to either, some of the crowd, like in between point. And he said he's never seen the speed, of a player like Alcaraz. We'll see what happens, over the years. But so I thought that was very interesting. A guy like Monfils, who could probably stay out there forever with everybody, just felt like, I guess it was just at a different level. That
I watched that match last night. Carlos gets to one or two balls more than everybody else.
Right.
And everyone's wondering, that's a rough way to play on your body. These guys slide on hard courts in a way I've never understood. But man, he is something else.
Yeah, and he's so young. That's the other piece of it. It's always fun to talk about this, and I'm sure you've had similar conversations about the icons in finance. But, is he the greatest player of all time? Kind of a comment drives me nuts. If Rod Laver, and this is just my theory, but if Rod Laver had all of the exposure and all of the scientific knowledge and programming and equipment, and I think he would have been as good as Alcaraz or any of these other people. They're out there hitting with wooden rackets, for God's sakes. But when you look at these people, they have incredible drive and intensity, but they're making so much money that I wonder if that's sustainable over can the hunger stay there over time? Federer was just an artist. You wouldn't say that his strength was drive. He just was a magician. Nadal, he had the fire, but his body gave in. So in finance, where they're making so much money, what's the motivation? How do they stay the test of time?
I feel like it's the same. You could mention Roger and Fed and not mention Djokovic, who somehow is
of course.
still,
I was going to chime in on that one.
Is still going. I think it's the same in that people may get into the business because of money. But when I started, it wasn't clear, right? Hedge funds weren't even a thing. It wasn't clear that if you did that, that was the path to riches. The industry grew. You were part of a growing industry, and there's a nice compensation scheme. But the people who stay in it are clearly, it's not. Maybe at some point in time they were motivated by money, but they're motivated by competing and winning it and loving that exact game that they're playing. So, take as an example, I hope Carlos lasts forever, and part of it is the sheer fun he has playing.
Yeah.
Like watching him in Monfils, there were a couple of points that were just so extraordinary. And afterwards, they're clapping for each other. They're, Roger and Rafa had that to some extent. On the court, they were super intense, but they were very, very friendly off the court. Not like my growing up with McEnroe and Lendl and these guys who it's not clear they liked each other. But there are people who have an innate joy for the activity where money's part of it, but it's not the true cause. And in the seat that I was in, where you're trying to figure out who would you like to be managing your money, that's a big part of the equation, right? You don't want someone who's interested in managing your money for this year. You're looking at longer term relationships, and you have to try to get into the intrinsic motivation of what's giving them that drive, and will it continue? Because people do ascend to different levels of wealth in this business, and some people, it really changes them. Others, it doesn't. And I was on the phone this morning with an old friend who I'll be interviewing for the show in 2 weeks. He's been in the business for 23 years. And is a hedge fund guy. I mean, he's long since made all the money. He had a brother who was super successful in the business, who's long since retired and is on boards now. His business, happened to be a Harvard Business School guy in class of 93. And there's probably 80 different people in that class of 800 that ended up in the hedge fund business. It was just the heyday. Very few of them are still going. So what is it about this guy that has him still going? He's not the biggest. He's not the best. He's very good, but he's not the best. He just loves it. He just loves the game.
This episode of the Wide Open Podcast is sponsored by Hydrus Performance Hydration. We all know it's important to stay hydrated during sports and physical activity, but hydration is equally important during a normal daily routine. If you experience low energy, dryness, such as eyes, mouth, or skin, or you have muscle and joint soreness, and especially if you suffer from an autoimmune condition and are on certain medications that will facilitate dehydration, your body may need more effective hydration to feel and function optimally throughout the day. Hydrus' breakthrough technology delivers water and electrolyte absorption with unrivaled speed and effectiveness for your tissues that need to restore balance and maintain function at all activity levels. Listen to your body and know you can use sugar-free Hydrus for any time throughout the day. So check out our website at hydrusedge.com. That's Hydrus, HYDRUSEDGE.com for more information about Hydrus Performance Hydration, and welcome to our new well-being hydration category. Use the code WELCOME20 for a 20% discount on your first order.
So I've written a book with Jim Zugg about fear of failure and Run to the Roar. And I've only been on the outskirts of finance my whole career as a coach, because I gave lessons to some of these people along the way. And there are many different motivators in life. But I have been around some highly successful people in finance who weren't driving to make more money. They just couldn't deal with the idea that someday at the bottom of the ticker, it was going to say one of the funds closed down. They just could not let someone else still be alive when they weren't. Have you seen some of that?
Not that specifically, but there are variations of that theme in spades. I'll tell you a fun story. Early on, when Warren Buffett and Bill Gates got together to create what became known as the Giving Pledge. So they were going to billionaires and asking them to pledge to give half their money away, either while they're alive or when they pass away. In the early years of that, after they reached out to the people they knew, they were having trouble getting traction and getting more people to sign on. And Warren called me one day and said, "Hey, you know some of these, rich hedge fund guys. Can you reach out?" I said, I don't know. I could try. And he said one of the things he was finding was that some of the people he met, and I won't name names, but very, very well-known, very successful multi-billionaire hedge fund managers, were afraid of losing their money. That they didn't think they could pledge to give it away because they didn't know if they'd keep it. And he said it was all from self-made people, and it was only from people who did it in the markets. He said there were no business entrepreneurs he met that were afraid that they couldn't go do it again. But there was something about the activity that fear, that's probably the same thing as the fear of, not being the guy to shut down. They had made all this money. They were afraid. They didn't think they could pledge to give it away because they honestly didn't think they would keep it.
That's wild. That's
Very,
wild.
very interesting. Just in terms of changing gears just a little bit, I was intrigued, and I didn't get really a chance to listen to the whole episode, but with Michael Milken, who had back in the 80s was like right on the forefront of New York. And so could you tell us a little bit about that and what you learned and what's he up to? And
Sure.
I mean, it was such a big to-do back then because he was the most prominent, one of the most successful, and ran into some troubles. And how did he come out of it, and how's he doing?
So for those not deeply ensconced in financial history, today, almost any company, big company, small company, can get access to money to grow, to get a loan to grow. In the 1970s, that wasn't the case. In the 1970s, unless you were a big established company with white shoe relationships with Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley, you couldn't really access money. And what Michael figured out was that if you gave these smaller businesses money that were perceived as higher risk and you basketed all them together, you would do better than if you'd given the big companies money. So he created what became known as the high yield market. Then they called it the junk bond market because people didn't want it. And he became super successful, became by far the market leader at a firm called Drexel Burnham. And most of the private credit markets today, which is a huge multi-trillion-dollar market, are all leaders who came out of Drexel that worked for Mike in the 70s. What we know today is that he's a bad guy who went to jail for some bad stuff. And that after that, which was in the early 90s, he's become one of the most successful philanthropists in terms of the impact he's had on education and healthcare in particular. So it's an interesting story. Like, well, what really happened? Because he's never talked about it. And through some friends, I was able to get him to agree to do an interview. And he had written a book. He's written a book last year about healthcare and cancer research. And the first 70 or 80 pages of the book, he talked about his path right up until the trouble, which is remarkable because he talks about his early life and all the influences. And I said, well, he won't talk about the bad stuff, but he will talk about that. I said, great. So we did that interview and it was fantastic. And the week after it came out, a friend of mine said, you need to meet this guy. He's Michael's personal attorney. I said, oh, okay. And I said, no, you need to have him on your show. He's a good friend of mine who has good judgment. I was like, okay. By the way, I just interviewed Mike. I think we're fine. And he said, no, you need to. So his name's Richard Sandler. I met Richard. Richard was Mike's older brother, Lowell's best friend from when they were kids. He was hired by Drexel in 1985, I believe. And within 2 years, all of a sudden, he became the lead defense attorney in this case against Michael. And it turned out, which I did not know, Richard wrote a book last year called, I think it's called The Prosecution of Michael Milken or something like that. And without going into the details, and I think the rules of the game were different back then than they are today. I've talked to people who were in the business, to be fair, who said, it's not clear that Mike did anything wrong, but he pushed the envelope in a lot of ways. He certainly pissed off a lot of the establishment. But every single person I talked to said that the prosecution and the sentence clearly was not appropriate for whatever the crime may have been. It's fine. It turns out, now people will understand it, that part of what happened has to do with how the U.S. Attorney General and in finance, the Southern District of New York, have incredible power to go after somebody. And it's often used for political gain. Not necessarily innocent till proven guilty. In fact, it's the opposite of that when they go after somebody. And it turns out that the lead prosecuting attorney at the time who fit that to a T is a guy named Rudy Giuliani.
Oh, baby.
So There was another book. I was intrigued because there was another book that came out in the early 90s I had written called Payback that was by a journalist at the time who looked at what happened and said, wait, this isn't what I was just following for the last 5 years. And that described, in a way that Richard Sandler didn't, but that described it as really a witch hunt by Rudy Giuliani. So I'm not weighing in on, I have no idea, did Michael do something terrible? What I do know, the things that he pled guilty to were hardly things that are considered a slap on the wrist. And yet he went to jail for, 2 years and has been seen by many who don't understand what happened as like a bad guy. It's a fascinating story.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Ted. Am I wrong in the early days when this was all new? I was a pro in Rye, New York in the middle 80s, and I gave a lesson to a young lady and went home, turned on the news to see her father being taken out of his office in handcuffs. And the reaction of all the members at the club at the time was, what is going on here? Everybody is doing this. And my mind, it was always, well, if I'm going to drive down the road at 75 miles an hour and everybody else is doing 75 miles an hour, but the policeman pulls me over, I say, you caught me, and put the handcuffs on. But I get the feeling from then till now where it's become so sophisticated, I think it was all the only way we're learning that there have been mistakes made is when mistakes get made, because there was no formula to say, these are bad people, they're doing bad things. Is there any relevance to that?
I don't know, right? I was a teenager at the time, so I wasn't really involved. I appreciate that. I appreciate you reminding me of that. So there were, in retrospect, there were things that were clearly on the wrong side of the law. There was an insider trading investigation led by a guy named Ivan Boesky. Sorry, not led by, but the head of which was a guy named Ivan Boesky, who was think of him as like, I don't want to name it, but like the largest hedge fund manager of the day. So he was the most important client to all of Wall Street, but he did a lot of bad stuff.
And I gave his twins tennis lessons.
Boesky's twins. Yeah. So he was part of, and there was a guy at Lehman and there was a guy at Goldman, and each of which were very much caught up in that.
Right.
It's not at all clear that Mike was.
Okay.
He dealt with Boesky, so did everybody else. But so what happened was they went after Boesky. He'd done a lot of things wrong. And he basically said to them, I'll give you Milken. And for that, he got nothing. He did really bad stuff and barely got a slap on the wrist. It's unclear, at least if you talk to Richard Sandler, because Mike won't talk about it, that it was pretty clear Ivan was lying, but they just took it at face value because he was the one giving them information. They
needed an example,
and Mike was the biggest guy to go after.
Wow, yeah. So interesting.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. So I speak to companies. In large part thanks to people like you. And it is interesting to me how the overlap between sport and business is large. And I have a very good friend at KKR, and he tells me often that they'll all stand around a board table, and they'll yell and scream and get animated, and they'll pound their hands on the table, and then a decision will get made, and they'll all put their KKR hats on, and they'll march off to the orders. And I think that's super cool and refreshing, because now we live in a world where we're more concerned with not offending someone than we are with getting it right. Have you seen that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, when good decision-making happens, that's how it happens. People are welcomed, encouraged to express different views. There are ways of setting the stage and setting the table so that happens. It's actually really important, for example, for the leader to speak last, because they have the biggest impact on how other people are thinking about decisions.
Bezos says that, right? He talks often about that.
And so there are aspects, the crux of making a good decision. So you think about a decision making, particularly under uncertainty. where you don't know what the outcome. You're picking a stock. You don't know what the outcome will be. You can't know. Your goal should be to get as much information as is available on the table before you make the decision. And you see two different types of organizations. So you see organizations that are dominated by the leader, that everyone just cows down to them. And they may be gifted at making a decision, but they're not going to have all the information because no one person is able to sort of see every perspective on every issue. And then you have organizations saying, that description of KKR's meeting room is maybe more aggressive than you might see most of the time. But you do have organizations where people are really encouraged to express their views. Now, those views don't necessarily mean that that's the decision, but all the views get brought on the table. And then the people that are making the decision can assimilate all that information and decide what direction to head in.
You say that, and it's one of the things I have found with people that I have so much respect for, including in the world of athletics, is the ability to take in tons and tons of information and distill it down to 2 or 3 things. I find that so intriguing, and I've seen a fair amount of that. Bill Belichick could do that. He would be on the phone all weekend in the out of season, talking to everyone that he knew and just collecting so much. And then boom, boom, here's where we're going. That's incredible.
Yeah, it is what makes great decision makers.
So I'm interested also from the perspective, and not to really get into politics or any side of the aisle or anything like that, but there's such a divide in this country. How is that, affect the investment world? And so just sort of an abridged version of that, because I'm sure it does have a large impact. And I'm just wondering how you see it.
Yeah. Well, you say the investment world, in some sense, encompasses the whole economy. And so you have to think about, how does that divide impact businesses on the one hand, or stock markets, or whatever the case may be. The short answer is, I don't know. It's not my area of expertise. I've always been, I would say, politically centrist, but more importantly than that, in some areas of my life, I can get pretty strong views on things. And in others, I really don't. And politics has been one of those, not because I'm, left, right, it doesn't matter. On many, many issues, I hear, a friend of mine who's on the left express passionately, pro-choice. I get pro-choice. I'm a man. I don't think I should dictate, what a woman does. And I'll say, yeah, that makes sense to me. And then there'll be someone who's, passionately pro-life and talking about, that embryo is a life. And I'd say, well, I don't know if I agree with that, but I kind of see what you're saying. Like, if I thought about it philosophically that way, I might have a view. There are so many issues in politics where I don't have a view. Like, I just hear both sides, and depending on who I talk to, I could easily be swayed one way or the other. So I personally am not political, and it's not because I think one is right or wrong or the other. There are things where I know I have a view about, and there are things I don't. And so much of what I see in politics falls into that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like that whole incident with Target, and that was, I guess, maybe like a year ago, where they had, certain kiosks in the store that, people felt offended to, and so it apparently, I mean, they lost a lot of money, a lot of, customers, and, appears that they're on their way back, because I think a lot of people, sort of let things go and, not dwell. And I'm sure they changed, some of the way they operate a little bit. That whole incident with Bud Light and, and how that took so there seems to be like this, you got to be careful. And I guess as the investor and where you're putting your money into a company like that, because it can change like on a dime. So I don't even know if you have the ability to get some of that information, earlier on when, things are starting to brew. And but that was a debacle with Bud Light. I mean, the amount of money is just incredible. how much Budweiser lost during the issue.
Yeah. So much of how I've spent my career are with pools of capital that have very, very long time horizons. And what I would say about politics, or an example like that with Target or Bud Light, is that the pendulum swings back and forth and back and forth. What really matters ultimately, say, for a business is, do they have a product, a service that people want over time and will continue to want over a long period of time? I don't know what's happening with Bud Light or their advertising. I do think people are going to be drinking beer for a long time. And it turns out people pay a lot to get beer and, to drink beer. So there are certain businesses that, sure, they can have the wrong leadership. They can make decisions that alienate part of their customer base. Some of those are happening because of politics. I mean, you look at the energy space, and people wanted to never touch a fossil fuel again a couple of years ago. And then you have the war break out in Ukraine, and all of Europe realizes, oh, wait, we might need some oil in order to get to the point in time where we're not as reliant on it in the future. These things go back and forth as it relates to markets. And I think you see that in politics too, right? Right now, there's a much, much bigger divide than there has been through most of my life. I hope it doesn't stay that way. I don't think it will. But you see, things like what happened with the university presidents this year. And all of a sudden, where that was this big push towards ESG over the last decade, maybe that pendulum's going to start to swing back a little bit. So if you look out over a long enough period of time, some of these things that are real issues and acute issues in the short term, they tend to soften over a longer period of time.
It's interesting that
we just had our last guest. No, I'm sorry, Paul.
Go ahead.
Up here with Bill Cullen, who is an author of like 25 books. He now teaches at Greenwich Country Day. And he was, we asked him a little bit about, because he's a, historian. And he was very, he thinks, he sees the good in people. And he feels like this is just we're passing through this time period, and we will come out of it like we've always done in the past. And so I thought that was very refreshing from someone who's, not that he's much older than us, but he really studies how things, have evolved, and learning from, issues in the past and duplicating things. And so I just, I hope, because it's not very productive at this point, the way, the political, as I call it, inferno is upon us. And so family time for you. I was intrigued when we were trying to set up this recording. And for me, with my work schedule, it's a little, sometimes easier at nighttime to do it. But you're like, that's family time. So tell us a little bit about your family and what you guys do together, and your kids. And I know one's going to go off to Clemson, which my daughter went to UT. So I know what that's like, because I went to Clark University, a small school in New England. And, the sporting life of a big university like that is incredible. And so tell us a little about what you do like to do with your kids and, on your spare time. And
I'm trying to decide if I should just let Coach answer all this for me, because he knows it's not always as smooth sailing as I'd like to make it sound. So I have 3 kids, twin 18s and a 14-year-old. I have 2 stepkids that are 18 and 20. They're off in college. So these days, my kids don't care if they spend time with me or not. They're teenagers, fortunately, off doing their own thing. But a couple of high level things. One of the frustrations in my life is, as mentioned with stepkids, I got divorced 8 years ago. I don't actually believe in quality time. I don't think that's a thing. I think with quantity, quality comes out of that. And you can't, as I've learned, being a divorced dad, or I'm going to go see my kids for dinner a couple times a week, I can't force that those are the days that we're going to have the real conversation that day, at that time, in that hour, because that's when we're having dinner. And that's been a good lesson, but a hard lesson in being divorced, because I don't have the quantity that I might have planned for in my life. But my kids are active. I grew them up skiing on weekends in Vermont, and so We spend time skiing together. My boys are workout nuts, like gym rats. And so we're talking about weightlifting and all that kind of stuff. So when I talk about family time, like I don't have a lot of distinction between my work and my personal time. Like I tell people I don't really work anymore. Like I spend a lot of hours doing something that other people call work. But so if I wake up on Sunday morning, I'm always like right here at my like there's something I want to read, there's someone I want to email, there's something I want to do, and I feel very blessed to have like gotten to that thing that somehow has a role that other people value and that there's money attached to it, so it becomes my livelihood. So I have to be careful about that because I would work all the time in other people's eyes, or my kids' eyes, or my wife's eyes. And so what I try to do is, at some point in time in the day, I put things down and I'll go veg out and hang out with the family.
I think that's great. I have a 25-year-old daughter and a 22-year-old son who's just graduating from Cornell in the spring. And I get it because, they'll come home and they'll want to hang out with us, but they want to be with their friends. They're young and it's fine. I think I heard, and I don't remember who it was, and but had mentioned that, when the kids are out of the house and to wonder if you really, done well by them is that they want to come and hang out with their folks or their father or whoever it might be in that case. And that's the testament. I think that's what it's all about. And you have to let them be free to get on with their life. And you don't want to be, like that helicopter, parent flying over and checking out and always inquiring exactly where they are, what they're doing and stuff like that. You just want them to feel comfortable in your presence. And that's a hard thing too. I mean, there's a lot of history there and a lot of stuff goes on. You're saying you were divorced. I'm sure that wasn't, easy for them or at all. But I think they understand more than you think. And I think till they get a little bit older, then they realize how you comported yourself, and they see all the good in that. And I think that's so important because family, when you get older, your circle becomes much smaller, and family is very important. So it sounds like you got it under control there, for sure.
Well, Ted, I watched you with your daughter in the college process, and you are a guiding, gentle hand, which is the absolute right way to do it.
You try, right?
Yeah. And, and in terms of sitting at that desk, Confucius says, he who loves what he does can never find work. And so you have found that purpose. It's interesting. We were talking, and I'm very focused right now on the perils of social media. And here we're using something to benefit people and to enlighten them. But for the younger people, this is a curse. And, one of the things we were talking about earlier in the podcast was, the thirst for blood of people who elevate their heroes only to take great joy in tearing them down. And I think perhaps to some extent, Milken was a victim of that, but one of the things that I'm quite interested in terms of human behavior is with social media, and I say this to the young coaches all the time, things are coming in faster and hotter than they've ever come in. But by the same token, they also pass faster and hotter than they've ever. So just put your head down. It's going to blow over. We're going to find another victim, within a few days, and just hang in there. But it's a crazy time out there with the social media.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen it with my kids. And I feel like these ages, these last 5 years, it clearly hasn't ever been worse. And I hope and think the pendulum will swing back the other way. But yeah, I've seen it, and you go through years saying, "Oh, it's my kids that are addicted to their phones," and my wife will say to me, "You never put your phone down."
I
We're just
know.
watching television here. And
I know.
I've found apps now to at least turn off certain other apps at night so that when I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm not going to my phone. It's
Right.
true dopamine. It's a real problem.
It's funny. I went out to dinner with my wife the other night. And when we go out on date night, we get about an hour, and then I got to get home and untie the babysitter. And so we went into the restaurant, and she looked at me and she said, "Sweetheart, I want to thank you for, leaving your cell phone in the car." And it was like, I left my cell phone in the car, and I wanted to run back to the car and get, no, I was happy to do that, honey.
Yeah, exactly.
So with all your experience, and I know you're in a different space right now, but any advice for like high school, college kids who are interested in pursuing a career in finance? Obviously, it was different when you were, reared and when you grew up. So what do you think if someone is truly, interested in that, how would you advise them today in terms of a type of career, that is involved, in the financial sector?
Yeah. I mean, I think the general lessons are the same anywhere, which is try to find a great mentor or a great organization that you can start at the bottom and look up in the organization and want to aspire to be in the roles that more senior people are with. In finance in particular, I don't think we're at the beginning of what will be a path of riches over the next 20 years. And so there's a well-known investor named Howard Marks, who, when people ask him, what advice would you give someone who wanted to build a business like you have? He said, the best piece of advice I could give is start 40 years ago.
Oh, wow.
Because that was the time to do it, not now.
Right.
So I think that, like anything else, if I were giving myself advice, it would be to find the thing that the aspects of what you're doing that you love. Finance is broad. I mean, there's sales and marketing jobs in finance. There are accounting jobs in finance. There's investing jobs in finance. It's just all of the roles are similar to what you could find anywhere. So it sort of really comes down to, what are the tasks that you like to do? Do you like working with spreadsheets? Could you see doing that every day for the rest of your life? My wife jokes with me. She'll come in and I'll be like, I'll have some spreadsheet of my expenses up. It's just like, she looks at that and says, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, it's like, and she, cowers away and says, oh my God, I'm so glad you do that, because I could. So I'm a numbers guy. So that's what I do on my weekends and my hobbies. And so it has more to do with that than it does finance or making money or whatever. It's sort of finding the things that you like to do that become part of your day.
That's interesting. Yeah, my son, he wants to go into the hospitality space, and but he doesn't know exactly which aspect. But it's like anything else, and you got to start, and you got to learn whatever business you go into from the ground floor, even the sub basement, and then build yourself up. Most of these really successful people, that's the way they started. And it may be a little bit longer of a time frame because you're not hitting it right away, but you're building that foundation, which I think is so key and so important.
Yeah, as I advise people, as being a college professor and coach, it's just to help them understand that the chances that your first job will be your last job are very, very slim. And so just get going. And then, maybe you find it, you hit it right, but it's going to be, a weaving, wandering journey. And as long as, to me, life is about building railroad tracks. And the first thing you do is you come up with a goal. I want to go to Newburgh, New York. Okay. Now you get down on your hands and knees and you start laying planks. And every so often you need to step up and say, am I still on track? But even more importantly, do I still want to go to Newburgh? And it's okay to change. But by the same token, never piss off the alligator until you cross the bridge. And I think people who just quit, and then you have to explain in the interview, well, why are you unemployed? So my advice to young people in that regard is, if you're not thrilled, do the best job you can, but build your bridge out of there and do it with character and class and dignity, so both parties end up satisfied with when you go.
Yeah, super important.
Yeah. So as we round this off, I just have one more question. So what motivates you to get out of bed in the morning?
His forehand.
Oh, yeah. Trying to figure out how to get that thing over a little more consistently. There have been plenty of times, not lots, but plenty of times in my life where for whatever reason, what I was doing, I did not want to get out of bed. And part of what gets me out of bed is just the gratitude that I'm not there right now. Like, it's super easy for me to get up out of bed. There's so many things, I like spending my first 2 hours working out, meditating, stretching. That's a new one.
Good luck with that.
And, I don't always get those 2 hours before I start working, but there's just so much that I get excited to do that it's not even an issue. If I were framing that as to why, it comes down to having found how I'm spending, call it my work time, in a way that is both relevant and helpful to people. It's kind of this hybrid of being like a professor and a practitioner. And it's just sort of a lucky sweet spot I found myself in. And because it so suits me and who I am, it's like every day is a weekend. So it's super easy to get up on the weekends.
Well, I mean, your presence, your wisdom, I mean, how relaxed you are. I mean, it's really a testament and to all the great stuff you've done. And I'm sure you have a lot more coming down the pike, but because you're ahead of the game. The podcasting thing is way ahead of the game. I've been in it for a couple of years, but it's hard to manage sometimes with a full-time career and then doing this like on the side. But I enjoy this so much, and this is why, because Paul and I have figured out a way to bring on some incredible people, and just learning their story, the pitfalls, some of the accolades, but. It's right. Paul is right. I mean, there is a common thread, and you see it. And everyone has a different approach. But this was really, really enlightening. And thank you. I really appreciate it. And I'll let Paul just capsulize this, and we'll go from there. But thank you again.
Yeah, well, Bruce, thanks. Before you even try, Coach, let me just say the single best part of doing a podcast, and not the reason I started, but is the breadth and interest of the people that you get to meet, and then some of whom you really get to form relationships with. Yeah. And I can't think of a better example of that than a great guy named Michael Barty, who I had on my podcast a number of years ago when he wrote a book. He published a little interview he did with Coach, I don't know, a year and a half ago, maybe 2. And I reached out to Mike and I said, hey, can you introduce me to this guy? Like, he seems pretty interesting. I grabbed his book. I read it. It talks about, like, I once wrote a book, incredible, Run to the Roar. And now there's so much, we just keep finding ways to help each other in different ways. And it's so much fun and so rewarding. So, Coach, I'm going to thank you for having me on as an early guest on Wide Open, and leave it with you to kick it out.
Well, it's a shared journey, and it's all about people. And you and I are now stuck in each other's spider webs, and how lucky we are for that.
Amen to that.
So have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Coach. Thanks, Bruce.
You can find this book, basically Capital Allocators, on Amazon. And I should have had mine signed, but maybe I can.
That's all right, Bruce. I have another one coming out. I
saw a couple on your desk over there behind you. I can see a couple.
There's a new one coming out in the fall, so we'll sign that one for you.
Thank you.
All right. Listen, thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, and really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Ted. Go Clemson.
All right, Ted.
Great. That was
fun.
You're
good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, man. Have a good day. Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to the Wide Open Podcast, a Zoa Soundworks production, hosted by Paul Asiante and Bruce Huberman as themselves. The show is produced and engineered by James Babalco. Theme song and incidental music created by Zoa Soundworks, LLC, in collaboration with Marco Guarino. Have a question, suggestion, or just want to say hello? Send us an email through our contact page at zoasoundworks.com. That's ZOASOUNDWORKS. It may be featured in a future episode. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe to the Wide Open Podcast. We upload a new episode every month. Look for us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you find your podcasts.